18 years old, standing on a cracked sidewalk with your entire life stuffed into a black trash bag. The foster system doesn't give you a graduation party, it gives you the door. But Leo's eviction notice came with a rusty key, and that key unlocked a 50-year-old secret. The heavy thud of the deadbolt sliding into place sounded like a gunshot in the quiet suburban morning. Leo stood on the porch, the rain slowly soaking through his thin canvas jacket. At his feet sat a 30-gallon trash bag holding the sum total of his existence on Earth. 5 t-shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, a heavily highlighted copy of a community college automotive textbook, and a socket wrench set he'd bought at a pawn shop. He was 18 today. In the eyes of the state, he was a man. In the eyes of his foster mother, Mrs. Gable, he was a discontinued paycheck. He didn't knock. He didn't yell. You don't spend 12 years bouncing between 7 different group homes and foster placements without learning how to take a hint. Leo slung the plastic bag over his shoulder, the sharp edge of the wrench box digging into his collarbone, and started walking toward the bus stop. The sky above the Rust Belt city of Camden was a bruised purple, threatening a downpour that matched the bleakness of the concrete beneath his worn boots. He had $42 in his pocket. He had nowhere to go. He spent the first 3 hours of his adulthood in a corner booth of a defeated diner, nursing a single cup of black coffee that the waitress kept topping off, out of pity. He was sketching a diagram of a transmission on a paper napkin when a man in a rumpled, off-the-rack suit slid into the booth opposite him. "Leo Thorne?" the man asked. His voice sounded like gravel and cheap cigarettes. Leo's eyes flicked up, his posture instantly rigid. "Who's asking?" "Arthur Pendleton's estate lawyer." The man pulled a damp, bent business card from his pocket and slid it across the Formica table. "Caldwell Legal Services. Your social worker gave me a heads up that you'd aged out today. I've been trying to track you down for a month." "I don't know an Arthur Pendleton." "He knew you," Caldwell said, opening a scuffed leather briefcase. "Or at least, he knew of you. He was your biological grandfather on your mother's side." Leo stared at the lawyer. A grandfather. The word felt completely alien in his mouth. He had spent his whole life believing he was a severed branch, unattached to any larger family tree. "If he knew about me, where was he for the last 18 years? "I just execute the wills, kid. I don't excuse the dead," Caldwell replied flatly. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and pushed it next to the coffee cup. "He passed away 6 weeks ago. Heart failure. Left everything to you." Leo didn't touch the envelope. His cynical mind, sharpened by years of broken promises from adults, immediately looked for the trap. "What's the catch?" Caldwell smiled. A tired, thin stretching of the lips. "Smart kid. The catch is that everything isn't much. It's a commercial property down in the industrial district. An old auto repair shop, Pendleton Garage. The deed is yours, free and clear." "A garage." Leo's grip on his pencil loosened slightly. "Before you start celebrating, there's a lien," Caldwell continued, shutting his briefcase. "Arthur hadn't paid property taxes in 5 years. You owe the county roughly $14,000. You have 30 days before they foreclose, seize the property, and auction it off to a developer." Leo let out a short, humorless laugh. "So my long-lost grandfather left me a $14,000 debt for my birthday. Generous guy. He left you a building. What you do with it is your business. Sell the scrap inside, try to pay the tax man, or sleep on the floor until the sheriff kicks you out. Not my problem anymore." Caldwell tapped the envelope. "The keys are inside. Happy birthday, Leo." The lawyer slid out of the booth and walked out into the rain, leaving Leo alone with the damp envelope. Leo sat there for a long time. The logical move was to throw the envelope in the trash. He couldn't pay 14 grand. But as he looked out the diner window at the gray, unforgiving streets, a harsh reality settled in. He needed a roof. Even a condemned roof with a 30-day expiration date was better than sleeping under an overpass. He ripped open the envelope. A heavy brass key, green with oxidation, fell onto the table. The industrial district of Camden was a graveyard of American manufacturing. Cavernous brick factories with shattered windows loomed over cracked asphalt streets, overgrown with weeds. Leo found Pendleton Garage at the dead end of a potholed alley. It was a squat, cinder block building with a corrugated tin roof. The painted sign above the roll-up bay doors was so faded the letters were barely legible. The place looked like it had been closed since the 90s. He fit the heavy brass key into the front door's deadbolt. It stuck. He had to wrap his jacket around his fist and hammer the key inward before it finally turned with a painful, metallic shriek. He pushed the door open. The air inside was thick, smelling of stale motor oil, mildew, and decades of undisturbed dust. Slats of gray light filtered through the filthy skylights, illuminating a space that was less a functioning garage and more a hoarder's sanctuary. Mountains of rusted engine blocks, towers of dry-rotted tires, and overflowing bins of oxidized metal parts dominated the floor. "Home sweet home," Leo muttered to the empty room. For the first week, survival was the only priority. Leo dragged a decaying mattress from a dumpster into the small, glass-paneled office at the front of the shop. It was freezing at night, but it was dry. During the day, he became a scavenger. He systematically tore through the mountains of junk, separating brass fittings, copper wire, and heavy iron. He loaded a rusted wheelbarrow he found in the corner and made grueling 3-mile treks to the local scrapyard. The scrap dealer, a heavily tattooed guy named Davis, robbed him blind on the exchange rate, but Leo didn't argue. He walked away with enough cash each day to buy bread, peanut butter, and bottled water. By the 10th day, his hands were covered in blisters and grease that wouldn't wash out. The physical labor was agonizing, but the silence of the garage was entirely his own. No screaming foster siblings, no heavy footsteps of angry guardians, just the quiet, steady rhythm of dismantling the past. It was on the 12th day that the anomaly caught his attention. Leo was sitting in the dingy front office, eating a cold can of baked beans. He had started going through Arthur's old filing cabinets, mostly looking for anything of value, a forgotten savings bond, a loose $20 bill. Instead, he found stacks of composition notebooks filled with frantic, cramped handwriting. His grandfather, it seemed, was deeply paranoid. The journals were filled with angry rants about the government, corporate theft, and a former business partner who had stolen his legacy. But amidst the rambling, there were incredibly detailed, masterful schematics for engine manifolds and suspension systems. Arthur hadn't just been a grease monkey. He was a brilliant, uncredentialed engineer. Leo flipped to the last journal, dated 3 years prior. The handwriting was shaky. "Dico, and they keep circling the property. Developers, vultures. They think it's just a junk heap. They don't know what's resting in the belly. 80 feet of scrap for the world, 20 feet of steel for my blood. The wall holds." Leo frowned, lowering the spoon. 80 feet of scrap, 20 feet of steel. He looked up at a faded architectural blueprint of the garage pinned to a corkboard on the office wall. According to the city plans, the building was 100 feet deep, stretching all the way back to the alleyway behind it. Leo stood up. He grabbed a heavy metal flashlight and walked out onto the shop floor. He started at the front door and walked backward, pacing out the length of the building by foot. 1 yard, 2 yards. He walked past the cleared-out tire racks, past the grease pit, past the mountain of rusted mufflers he hadn't tackled yet. He reached the back wall of the garage. He stopped. He had only counted 26 paces, roughly 80 feet. Leo stared at the back wall. It was constructed of floor-to-ceiling corrugated metal sheets, heavily bolted into a steel frame. Old metal shelving units, heavily laden with useless, rusted carburetors and scrap iron, were shoved tight against it. To anyone else, it just looked like the messy back end of an old building. He walked up to the metal sheeting and knocked on it with the heavy end of his flashlight. Clang, clang. It didn't sound like it was hitting the solid cinder block that made up the exterior of the building. It sounded hollow. Leo's heart did a strange, unfamiliar flutter against his ribs. He immediately killed the hope rising in his chest. "Don't be stupid," he told himself. "It's probably just a storage closet full of toxic asbestos or unpaid bills." But his hands were already moving. It took him 6 hours to move the shelving units. The iron was dangerously heavy, and by the time he cleared the space in front of the wall, his muscles were trembling with exhaustion, his shirt soaked in cold sweat. He grabbed his pawn shop socket wrench and found the right size for the heavy lag bolts, securing the corrugated tin. The bolts were rusted solid. Leo had to use a steel pipe slipped over the wrench handle as a cheater bar, throwing his entire body weight into it. With a deafening crack, the first bolt broke free, then the second, then the third. By 2 a.m., he had unbolted a massive 6-by-8-foot section of the metal wall. Breathing heavily, dust clinging to his eyelashes, Leo wedged a pry bar under the edge of the tin and threw his weight backward. The metal sheet groaned, buckled, and collapsed backward with a thunderous crash that sent a cloud of 50-year-old dust billowing into the air. Leo coughed, waving his flashlight through the dense gray cloud. As the dust slowly settled, the beam of his light pierced the darkness of the hidden room. It was a perfectly sealed, climate-controlled bay, 20 feet deep. The walls were lined with pristine, heavy-duty toolboxes that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. But Leo barely noticed the tools. His eyes were locked on the center of the room. Resting on 4 heavy jack stands, draped in a thick, dust-caked canvas tarp, was the massive silhouette of an automobile. Leo stepped over the fallen metal sheet, the crunch of his boots on the concrete sounding unnaturally loud. He approached the shape slowly, almost reverently. He reached out, grabbed the corner of the heavy canvas, and pulled. The tarp slid off, heavily pooling onto the floor. Leo stared. The cynical armor he wore every day cracked just for a second, giving way to profound confusion. It was a car, but it was hideous. It looked like a Frankenstein monster of automotive parts. The body panels were cheap, unfinished fiberglass, loosely resembling a late 1970s Pontiac. But the proportions were entirely wrong. The hood was impossibly long, the wheel arches flared out aggressively, and the rear end was abruptly cut off. It was painted in a dull, uneven primer gray. "A junker," Leo whispered, the crushing weight of disappointment settling instantly into his shoulders. His grand inheritance, his hidden treasure, was a botched, half-finished custom job that a madman had walled up because he was too embarrassed to look at it. He kicked the front tire in frustration, but instead of the dull thud of dry-rotted rubber on cheap steel, his boot connected with something that rang like a tuning fork. Leo froze. He crouched down, shining his flashlight directly onto the wheel. He wiped away a thick layer of grime with his thumb. The wheel wasn't steel. It was cast magnesium, extremely lightweight, extremely expensive, the kind of wheel used exclusively in high-end vintage motorsport racing. Frowning, Leo laid down on the cold concrete and shimmied under the front bumper of the ugly fiberglass shell, shining his light upward into the guts of the machine. He stopped breathing. Underneath the cheap, ugly fiberglass exterior was a chassis. But it wasn't a chopped-up Pontiac frame. It was a masterpiece of hand-welded, tubular steel trellis. The suspension components were pure aerospace-grade aluminum, machined to a tolerance that Leo had only ever seen in his college textbooks. The undercarriage was immaculate, completely devoid of rust, protected by a thin layer of cosmoline grease. This wasn't a junker. The ugly fiberglass shell was a disguise, a cheap Halloween mask hiding the face of a god. Leo scrambled out from under the car, his heart now hammering violently against his ribs. He rushed to the front of the car and searched for the hood release. He found a hidden latch tucked inside the wheel well and yanked it. The heavy, ugly fiberglass hood popped up. Leo lifted it, propping it open. He stared at the engine bay, his mouth slightly open, the flashlight trembling in his hand. It was a V12 engine, but not just any V12. It was a massive, naturally aspirated leviathan of polished aluminum, 6 dual-choke Weber carburetors sitting proudly on top, their intake trumpets gleaming in the beam of his light. The valve covers were painted a distinctive, aggressive red. Leo didn't know the exact year or model yet, but he knew enough about cars to recognize what he was looking at. He was looking at a 1960s Italian racing engine. He was looking at something that belonged in a museum in Maranello. Not behind a false wall in a condemned garage in Camden. He walked around to the driver's side and yanked the door open. The interior was stripped bare, no carpet, no radio, just two worn leather bucket seats, a wooden steering wheel, and a pristine metal dashboard populated by analog dials. And resting on the driver's seat was a small, locked metal strongbox and a single, sealed envelope with the name Leo written on it in Arthur's shaky handwriting. Leo's grease-stained fingers hesitated over the envelope. His name was written in a jagged, aggressive cursive. He broke the seal. Inside was a single piece of heavy, yellowed stationery. Leo, if you're reading this, the state finally spit you out, and you had nowhere else to go. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I wasn't fit to raise a kid. I was barely fit to raise myself. My daughter, your mother, figured that out early. By now, you've seen the ugly duckling. In 1971, my business partner got in deep with some very bad people. He wanted to liquidate the shop to save his kneecaps. He specifically wanted to chop up the chassis sitting in front of you and sell the aluminum for scrap. He didn't know what it was. He just saw raw metal. I did. It's a 1961 Ferrari 250 GT Berlinetta Passo Corto, an aluminum-bodied competition spec, one of maybe 40 ever built. It was brought into the country by a privateer racer who blew the transmission at Sebring, dumped it at our shop, and went broke before he could pay for the rebuild. He abandoned it. When my partner brought the torches out, I panicked. I stripped the original aluminum body panels off, packed them in crates, and shipped them to a storage unit in Ohio. I built that hideous fiberglass shell over the chassis overnight so the mob guys wouldn't recognize it. Then I built the wall. I took the beating when they came looking for the inventory, and I kept my mouth shut. The keys to the strongbox are taped to the back of this letter. Inside are the original VIN plates, the import documents, and the deed to the Ohio storage unit. It's not a junker, kid. It's a ghost. Wake it up. Arthur. Leo lowered the paper. The silence in the sealed room was absolute, pressing against his eardrums. He looked at the ugly gray fiberglass shell, then down at the letter. Leo had read about cars like this in the ratty magazines donated to the group home libraries. They were unicorns, mechanical royalty. They traded hands between billionaires in Monaco and Swiss bankers for amounts of money that didn't feel real. And one was sitting on jack stands in front of a kid who had eaten a can of cold beans for dinner. He pulled a small brass key taped to the back of the letter and unlocked the strongbox. Inside sat a pristine, stamped metal chassis plate. Ferrari 250 GT Comp chassis, number 2735. Beneath it lay a stack of faded customs paperwork from 1963. It was real. But paperwork didn't pay a $14,000 tax lien. The county's clock was ticking. He had 18 days left. To prove what this was to anyone with real money, he needed to prove the heart still beat. Leo went to work. He didn't sleep for the next 3 days. He dragged a generator into the sealed room. He drained the engine's fluids. The old oil came out looking like black molasses. He pulled the spark plugs and carefully poured Marvel Mystery Oil directly into the 12 cylinders, letting it soak into the seized piston rings. With a heavy breaker bar attached to the crankshaft pulley, Leo put his entire body weight into turning the engine over by hand. For 2 hours, it refused to budge. 50 years of stillness fought him. He screamed in frustration, his palms blistering, tears of pure exhaustion mixing with the grease on his face. Then, with a sickening metallic pop, the crankshaft turned. He spent the next 48 hours cleaning the 6 Weber carburetors with a toothbrush and a can of solvent, regapping fresh spark plugs, and rigging a plastic boat gas tank directly to the fuel pump. On the evening of the 20th day, he sat in the cracked leather driver's seat. He hooked a heavy-duty marine battery to the terminals. The air in the sealed room was thick with the smell of high-octane racing fuel and old dust. He turned the ignition key. The fuel pump clicked frantically. Tick, 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 tick. He pressed the starter button. The starter motor whined, a high, desperate gear reduction sound. The massive V12 engine turned over. It coughed, spat a violent cloud of black smoke out of the straight pipe exhaust, and died. Leo didn't panic. You don't rush a resurrection. He pumped the throttle twice, shooting raw fuel down the throats of the carburetors. He pressed the button again. A backfire shook the concrete floor. He kept his thumb on the button. Suddenly, the engine caught. 12 cylinders detonated in rapid, violent succession. The sound was deafening, a physical force that hit Leo in the chest. It didn't purr, it screamed. It was a vicious mechanical roar, a symphony of synchronized valves and exploding fuel that echoed off the cinder block walls like a trapped beast. Leo sat in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wooden steering wheel, the entire chassis vibrating underneath him. He pressed the throttle slightly. The engine snapped back instantly, RPMs flaring with terrifying speed. He cut the ignition. The engine spun down into silence. Leo leaned his forehead against the steering wheel. He was shivering for the first time in his 18 years of life. He had something that belonged to him. Day 25, 5 days until foreclosure. Leo stood by the rusted roll-up doors of the garage, watching a sleek, black Mercedes S-Class navigate the potholes of the alleyway. The car parked and a man stepped out. His name was Richard Hayes. He was a senior acquisitions broker for a blue-chip classic car auction house out of Manhattan. Leo had found his number in a 5-year-old copy of Motor Trend. He had texted Hayes a single, well-lit macro photograph of the chassis plate resting on the red valve covers of the V12, along with the address. Hayes was a man completely out of his element. He wore a tailored navy suit and Italian loafers. He looked at the dilapidated facade of Pendleton Garage with open disgust, stepping carefully over a puddle of murky water. "You're the Thorn kid?" Hayes asked, his eyes scanning Leo's filthy jacket and grease-stained hands. "Just Leo," he replied, "in the back." Leo led the broker through the dark, cluttered shop. When they reached the breached wall, Hayes stopped. He looked into the climate-controlled room, his eyes landing on the dull gray fiberglass shell. Hayes let out a sharp, condescending sigh. "Kid, you dragged me down to Camden for a kit car. I told you on the phone, a chassis plate can be faked. This is a Pontiac Fiero with a bad body kit. You're wasting my time." Hayes turned to leave. "Look under the hood," Leo said. His voice was flat, unbothered. Hayes paused. He looked at the teenager, expecting to see a nervous kid trying to pull a scam. Instead, he saw cold, deadpan confidence. Hayes walked back. He reached into the wheel well, found the latch, and lifted the heavy fiberglass hood. The broker stopped breathing. He stared at the immaculate aluminum V12 engine. He traced his manicured fingers over the tubular steel chassis, inspecting the hand-laid welds. He looked at the Weber carburetors, the distributors, the suspension geometry. 10 minutes passed in complete silence. Hayes pulled a small flashlight and a magnifying loupe from his breast pocket, inspecting the stamping on the engine block. When he finally stood up, the condescension was entirely gone. His face was pale. "The original aluminum bodywork?" Hayes asked, his voice tight. "Crated in a climate-controlled unit in Ohio. I have the deed and the keys," Leo said. Hayes slowly wiped his hands with a silk pocket square. He looked at Leo, his mind calculating at light speed. He saw an 18-year-old kid living in a condemned garage. He saw a desperate situation. "It requires a full, frame-off restoration," Hayes said smoothly, sliding back into his negotiator persona. "Taking off this fiberglass abomination, rehanging the original aluminum, rebuilding the gearbox. That's a $500,000 job. The market is volatile, but I can offer you a private sale. Today, I will wire you $200,000 this afternoon. You can walk away from this dump and start a real life." $200,000. To a kid who had $42 to his name a month ago, it was lottery money. It was a house. It was safety. Leo looked at the car. Then he looked at Hayes. "No," Leo said. Hayes blinked. "Excuse me. You're a shark, Mr. Hayes, but you're swimming in the wrong tank," Leo said, his voice dropping into a register that sounded far older than 18. "You wouldn't have driven 2 hours down here if it wasn't worth millions. Chassis 2735 is a competition spec. If I give it to you for 200 grand, you'll restore it and flip it at Monterey next year for 8 million, maybe 10. Hayes' jaw tightened. "You have a tax lien, Leo. I did my homework on this property on the drive down. You owe 14 grand by Friday, or the county seizes the building and everything inside it. You have zero leverage." "I have the keys," Leo shot back. "And I have a can of gasoline and a match. I'll burn this whole building to the concrete before I let a suit from Manhattan steal my grandfather's legacy for pennies. Hayes stared at the boy. The threat wasn't a bluff. He saw the cold, institutionalized hardness in Leo's eyes. This kid had survived the system. He wasn't afraid of losing. "What do you want?" Hayes asked quietly. "I can sign it to your auction house. We sign a legally binding contract right now. You handle the transport, the restoration, and the sale. You take a standard 10% broker's commission on the final hammer price." Leo stepped up closer to the broker, refusing to break eye contact. "And you write me a non-refundable cash advance for $50,000 today to clear my liens and keep my lights on." Hayes looked at the masterpiece hidden under the ugly gray shell. He did the math. 10% of 10 million was still $1 million. He reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a leather checkbook and a Mont Blanc pen. "I'll have my legal team draft the consignment papers by tonight," Hayes said, writing out the check against the hood of the Mercedes. He tore it out and handed it to Leo. Leo took the check. He didn't smile. He just folded it carefully and put it in his front pocket. 2 days later, a massive enclosed transport truck pulled into the alleyway. A team of white-gloved technicians carefully loaded the gray fiberglass shell into the trailer. Leo stood on the loading dock, drinking a cup of cheap diner coffee, watching the ghost roll away. When the truck finally disappeared down the street, Leo walked back inside. The garage felt massive. It was empty again, but it didn't feel heavy anymore. He walked into the small front office. He looked at the faded Pendleton garage blueprint on the wall. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the receipt from the county tax assessor's office. The $14,000 was paid. The building was his. The land was his. Leo picked up a push broom and started sweeping the concrete floor. He had a lot of work to do. He needed to clear out the rest of the junk. He needed to paint the walls. He was going to buy a new toolbox, hang a new sign out front, and open the bay doors. He wasn't a forgotten kid anymore. He was Leo Pendleton, and he had finally found his way home. Did Leo's story of grit and a hidden V12 masterpiece keep you hooked? The world is full of forgotten treasures waiting for the right person to dust them off. If this journey from an empty pocket to a multi-million-dollar legacy inspired you, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a massive underdog victory, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below. What would you have done with the garage?